Mental health has become center stage for the season, but has always been a central topic among Gen Z. Anxiety, panic, depression, trauma, these are all common conversations among this generation. So we're here to talk about mental health in Gen Z. We want to know how to best care and understand this generation. And we're also here with a professional therapist to hear her experiences with Gen Z and to understand how to best care and understand this generation. So I'm excited to be here. Hi, I'm Alan's son, and I have been working with college students for the past 15 years in San Diego. I work for a national nonprofit Christian org, and the past 4 years, I've been writing, thinking, presenting, and talking about Gen Z. You can visit me at alanbson.com for more information, but I'm really excited to be here with my friend and coworker, Melissa McCormick. And so, Melissa, tell us about yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Melissa. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist here in San Diego. I have a fully online practice where I specialize in trauma, eating disorders, and anxiety. In addition to that, I also have been working with college students for the past 10 years at local campuses in San Diego. And you can find more about me at melissamccormicktherapy.com.
That's great. Thanks, Melissa. And so we want to go through a few questions and just try to understand how do we best talk about mental health and Gen Z. First off, Melissa, you fall into the millennial category, which is between 1983 and 1996. And in your professional experience, I just want to know, how have you seen the need for therapy just increase over time?
Yes, so Gen Z is more likely than even millennials to want therapy. And what we have found is that they are also more likely to report higher levels of dissatisfaction in their lives. And I think those two things are paired together. So we have seen an increase in seeking out of therapy, likely due to the increases in dissatisfaction in life overall.
Yeah. I find it interesting too that it's become so commonplace to talk about mental health, but also I think there are some things that are still too taboo to talk about. So using medication, hospitalization, even conversations around suicide. I think that these things have still become really like red tape to talk about. But can you maybe explain from your professional experience or thinking, why is that so? Like, why are these things still there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that though Gen Z do report higher levels of loneliness and depressive symptoms, there are still topics like medication, hospitalization, suicide that are still difficult to talk about. So though we do see that the stigma around mental health is decreasing, there are still topics that are painful and difficult to talk about. And part of that has to do with the fact that different people groups have different access to things like medication and hospitalization. And so the stigma is still present in certain communities.
Yeah. I'm hoping, I mean, personally, just my own experience with therapy and in my family, I think I've seen the benefits of medication, but I've also seen the social stigma and maybe even a religious stigma that comes with using medication instead of just, let's say, pray that away or do this. And I think it's really important that we bring more awareness that it's okay to get medication, it's okay to actually work through these issues. So I appreciate that a lot, Melissa. The other thing, what we see in Gen Z is a lot of this social anxiety. So when Gen Z, for our college students that we work with, when they go to order something at Starbucks, there might be some social anxiety or there might be some fear in large groups. But then when it comes to social issues, we see this growing courage that happens to stand up in public for global issues, for climate change, for racial inequities. Why do you think that is, Melissa?
Yeah, it's an interesting, what we would call a polarization. It's an interesting kind of combination of attributes of this generation specifically. I think part of that just has to do with, first, the fact that Gen Z has a deep value for equality. They care very, very much about equality. And research has shown that they are more likely than past generations to have been exposed to diverse backgrounds of different kinds of people. And if it's classes or sports or their neighborhoods, they're more likely to have had those experiences growing up. And so we know when people are more likely to have had experiences with diversity in their life, they're more likely to care about equity. So we know that this is a really strong value, but we also know that this generation reports higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of loneliness. And so I think those two things, they can exist at the same time. These students, these people in this generation can care very much about equity and care very much about social justice, and they can also be anxious and stressed in day-to-day activities. Those things can exist together.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Melissa. I wonder about that. Sometimes it does seem like a polarization for Gen Z to hold these two, but be courageous in public spaces. But then, we see that a lot because we have these social media platforms. We have TikTok, we have Instagram, we have places where we can be in front of many people just through a screen. But then it is surprising that in these larger issues that they are very vocal. But then the social anxiety, I don't know if you've had experience talking with a lot of Gen Z with their social anxiety. How do you think we can best care for that situation? Again, like just the polarization, how can we care for someone who's going through social anxiety? Maybe you can speak into that a little bit too.
Yeah, well, I think when we're treating social anxiety from a therapeutic perspective, what we would attempt to do is to lower anxiety levels in their life overall. And so as we work on anxiety in their day-to-day life, if it comes from an experience of trauma or not, either way, as we lower anxiety overall in their lives, those types of social interactions will hopefully get easier with time. So there's different ideas around exposure therapy and forcing people to do things that they're not comfortable with. That wouldn't be my recommendation. My recommendation would be to help get students, this generation in general, into therapy if they're experiencing anxiety or social anxiety, to help lower and decrease anxiety in their lives so that they can function in a way that feels authentic to who they are.
Yeah, that's great, thanks. I've also heard like conferences sometimes will have spaces where the Gen Z can decompress or process certain things that are happening. I know a lot of organizations do conferences right now, and it's always, in the past, for millennials, it's been a big stage, lights and music and a speaker, and that's been central. But we've seen a decline in that in various spaces. But I'm realizing, like these safe spaces or these courageous spaces that we need for Gen Z to have to tackle social anxiety and to actually encourage therapy for students that we work with or other people in this generation, I think is really, really important. So I appreciate what you're saying there, so thanks. So how, we talked about social media a little bit, and I feel like it's a love-hate relationship with social media right now for Gen Z. And that's just my perspective, and again, I could be wrong, but from your perspective, how do you describe that relationship with mental health and social media? How do you see the either ups and downs or connections with that?
Yes, it is a bit of a hot topic. I think it can be quite easy for other generations to blame the loneliness or the depression that Gen Z is experiencing entirely on social media. What we know is, as we saw increases in social media usage rise in the previous 5 years, we also saw mental health symptoms and concerns rising as well. So we cannot say that they are one for one, absolutely linked, but what we do know is when people spend more time on social media, they do report more symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so I think there are probably multiple reasons for that. One of which is, if you're spending more time on social media, you're spending less time being present in your life and present connecting with people around you. So there's that aspect. It can lead to more disconnection in your life. And also the content with which you are looking at or spending time on social media could also be putting some type of pressure on you emotionally. So I think both of those things are true. But in addition to that, social media can serve as a place where people are experiencing community and where social media is being destigmatized. So it is quite complicated, but what we can do is help people connect with each other in real life as well as online. So as much as we can create spaces online, which we're hoping to do and continuing to do so that people can connect, especially people who are in places where they can't find connection that they need, we also want to encourage continual in-person connection.
That's great, yeah. And I appreciate what you had to say about encouraging both in-person connections, but there also is a way that people who have been voiceless have a voice on these platforms. And so when we think about, again, racial inequities and things like that, we also get a platform that's helpful and beneficial. But too much social media feels like, just like in the past, too much TV and you just zone out. And I think that's really important. What you said is the importance of physical connection. And we've all felt that this past season with the pandemic and understanding, wow, in face-to-face social connection is really important too. And it's very vital in terms of your mental health process and growth too. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Lastly, I think I wanted to ask, what advice do you have for those working with Gen Z in regards to addressing mental health? Like, what advice do you have as a professional therapist too?
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth mentioning that the trends that I have been communicating, the ways that we've seen Gen Z report higher levels of loneliness and depression, that research is from 5 years. It started 5 years ago, before the pandemic. So we can imagine that if those trends were already going up before the pandemic, we can only imagine what these students or people are experiencing now, post-pandemic, after the isolation and the experience of this racial reckoning that we have had. So what I would recommend is first, help people get into therapy, help students and people find resources that they need to get the support that they need. And so if we, as millennials or whatever generation we're coming from, if we have some issues with therapy or we feel like it is maybe not helpful, I would recommend maybe working that out yourself, dealing with that so that we can help this generation get what they need. In addition to that, as I mentioned previously, help these students and this generation connect in person. So creating ways for them to connect in ways that are not overwhelming for them, but that do create spaces of connection in person.
And I really appreciate that, Melissa, what you had to say, because as an Asian American, I think there's always been a cultural perception of shame and honor. And I told my mom when I went to therapy for the first time, I said, hey mom, I'm working through some things and I'm seeing a therapist. And she said, what's wrong with you? And I was like, wow, that's not the response I was expecting at first. And over time, she saw how it helped my life, just being able to talk with someone, and that has taken that stigma away. But also I can only imagine right now for Gen Z, just all the things that they have to face, but then there's cultural expectations, but then also there's going to be just a sense of like, you need to be on your A game each time. If you're going to college or university, you have to be on top of everything and face the pandemic and face social pressures and anxiety and there's a reason why I think this generation has been calling on gloom and doom for the past few years. And I think that's the part where maybe this is the extra question that I have for you, Melissa, is how do we give hope? What's a good way to speak hope? And yes, it is like, hey, like I think you should think about therapy. Is there any other maybe encouraging words or things that we could say to this generation to help them in the season?
Yeah. Well, I think after spending the last however many years working with Gen Z, I feel incredibly hopeful for the future. And I feel really honored to get to work with this generation specifically because of the ways that they are pushing things forward, like mental health and racial justice. So as much as there is a lot of really difficult and painful things happening in our country and in our world right now, when I think about this generation moving into leadership in the decades to come, I feel really hopeful about what that'll mean for us and for generations to come. So to Gen Z, I would say keep doing what you're doing. I know it is hard. I know that loneliness and depression and anxiety are such difficult things to live with day in and day out. But I do think that you hold something really special that we need and that the world needs. And I'm really excited to see you continue to grow into that. And for those of us who are working with Gen Z, I would say fan their flame. And if there are aspects of them that feel difficult for you, work that out so that we don't squash them, because I think that they have something really, really special for us.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Melissa. It's always important to just reserve that judgment if you're from a different generation, and to also be highlighting what attributes of Gen Z that we see that are beautiful, that they bring to the table. So I really appreciate that. Really appreciate the time and your thoughts. So thank you.